19 inches. That is the clearance between the underside of a 1911 floor joist and the top of a rubble stone foundation in a house on Standish Street in Fentress, Ohio. 19 inches is not enough room to stand. It is not enough room to sit up. It is exactly enough room for a grown man to lie on his side, breathe slowly, and listen to a 7-year-old girl talk to her stuffed rabbit 6 inches above his face. I'm Nathan. I spend most of my week reading stories about people who lie to each other, and this one landed differently, because the house in this story never lied at all. The house had been telling the truth for over a year. It told the truth in warm air where there should have been cold. It told the truth in a power bill in July. It told the truth in a floorboard that answered wrong when you stepped on it. And it told the truth in a child's drawings that every adult in her life, including her own father, decided to treat as a symptom instead of a report. Here is the part worth keeping, and I want you holding it before we start. A building is an instrument. It records everything that happens inside it, in heat and pressure and moisture and sound, and it has no motive to protect anybody. People do. That difference is the whole story. Remember the number, 19 inches. It comes back at the end, and it does not mean the same thing twice. Dermot Vickery made his living finding what buildings were hiding, and he was good enough at it that 3 counties called him before they called an architect. On the morning this story really begins, he was standing in the gutted second floor of a shuttered elementary school in Fentress, with a thermal camera braced against his cheekbone, watching a wall bloom orange in a place a wall had no business blooming. The school board had a bid on the table to demolish the building. Dermot had 11 minutes of footage that said the roof was fine, the masonry was fine, and the entire problem was a hot water line somebody had buried in the north wall in 1962 and forgotten about. The building was not dying. The building was bleeding, quietly, in a place nobody had thought to look. Buildings don't lie, he told the board that afternoon, and he did not say it like a slogan. He said it the way a man says a thing he has staked a mortgage on. People lie, records lie, contractors lie. Buildings just sit there and record. All you have to do is measure them instead of arguing with them. He had gotten that from his father, who had climbed poles for the Rural Electric Co-op for 31 years, and who had exactly one piece of advice for his son, delivered so often it had worn smooth. Trust the meter, not the man holding it. Dermot had turned that into a 2-man business called Vickery Building Diagnostics, a van full of infrared cameras and blower doors and data loggers, and a reputation in the Muskingum Valley for walking into arguments and ending them with numbers. He was 41. He had a good back, a bad knee, and a laugh he had to be surprised into. His partner, Wilbur Truesdale, was 63 and had taught him the trade and never let him forget it. And he had a house on Standish Street that he loved with an embarrassing intensity because it was the first thing he had ever owned that had been built by people who cared. 1911, 4 square, quarter-sawn white oak floors laid before the First World War, the grain in them like weather on a map. 12-foot ceilings on the first floor, a staircase with a newel post somebody had turned by hand. When Dermot and Rosanna bought it 7 years earlier, he had sat on the stripped floor of the front room at 2 in the morning with a work light and just looked at the joinery, the way other men look at a boat. Rosanna Vickery, born Rosanna Bramhall, had grown up 4 blocks away and had not wanted the house. She had wanted the new construction out on the county road with the kitchen island and the garage that connected to the mudroom. She had said yes to Standish Street, the way people say yes to things they intend to renegotiate later. She worked from a converted sunroom off the back of the house, doing medical billing and coding for 3 orthopedic practices, which meant she was home, alone, in that house, from 7 in the morning until whenever she felt like closing the laptop. Dermot had always thought of that as a kindness the universe had done them. Somebody was always home. Their daughter Hallie was 7 and had inherited the wrong half of each parent, which is to say the good half. She drew floor plans. Not houses, floor plans, overhead, with the walls in double lines and the doors as little arcs, because that was how her father's paperwork looked, and she had decided at 4 that this was what drawing was. She kept them in a plastic accordion folder with a picture of a fox on it. She could tell you which way was north in any room of her school, and for 2 years she had not slept properly. It had started in the spring she turned 5. She would wake up at some point past 2 and stand in the doorway of her parents' room without saying anything, which was somehow worse than screaming. When they asked her what was wrong, she gave answers that got more specific over time instead of less, which is the opposite of how a nightmare usually behaves. There was a man in the floor. He was quiet. He was not mean. He had a light that was orange, not white. Sometimes he coughed, and it sounded like the furnace starting. He liked when she read out loud. He knew the name of her rabbit. She drew him, over and over, in the overhead style, because that was the only style she had. A rectangle for the room, a smaller rectangle under her bed, and inside it, a shape like a person lying on his side, with no face, because she had never seen one. Dermot did what a reasonable man does. He looked under the bed. He pulled the bed out. He knocked on the boards. He crawled the basement with a flashlight and found nothing but a rubble foundation and the same cobwebs that had been there in 2017. He told his daughter, in the gentlest voice he had, that there was nothing under there, and he told it to her more than once, and every time he told it, he was standing 11 feet from the truth. Rosanna took a harder line, and she took it early. She wanted a specialist. She found Dr. Aaron Mulvaney in Zanesville within a week, and she drove Hallie to every appointment herself, and she was the one who filled out the intake forms and the between-session logs. Dermot went to 2 of the first 4 sessions and then stopped, because Rosanna told him the child was performing for him, that Hallie escalated when he was in the room, that his presence was making the treatment less effective. It sounded clinical. It sounded like something a doctor had said. The diagnosis that came back was a mouthful about parasomnia with hypnagogic hallucinations, and the recommendation was a sleep protocol, a low dose of something to break the cycle, and the part Rosanna underlined in the report with a real pen, a firm household policy of not reinforcing the content of the episodes. Not reinforcing the content, meaning, when your daughter says there is a man under the floor, do not go look. Do not knock on the boards with her. Do not perform a search, because the search teaches her the fear is real. Dermot hated it. He argued for a week. And then he lost, the way men lose those arguments, which is not in a single loud moment, but in a slow accumulation of being told, by his wife and by a piece of paper with a doctor's name on it, that his instinct to go look was selfish, that he wanted to be the hero of his daughter's nightmare more than he wanted her to sleep. So he stopped looking. That is the sentence he would come back to for the rest of his life, and no version of it ever got easier. He stopped looking, in the one house on earth where looking was his actual profession. There was one more rule, and it was Rosanna's, and she had made it a joke so it would not sound like a rule. The cameras stayed in the van. She had started saying it their first year in the house, laughing, when he came in from a job with the infrared still slung over his shoulder. Absolutely not. You are not scanning this house. I know exactly what you'll find, and I don't want to hear about the windows for 6 months. It became a bit. It became the thing she said at parties, and people always laughed, because it was funny. The building doctor who was not allowed to diagnose his own home. It became so much a part of the furniture of their marriage that Dermot never once heard it for what it was. A woman had spent 7 years making sure her husband's instruments never came through the front door. To understand what was under the floor, you have to understand what was under the marriage, and that goes back further than the house. Rosanna Bramhall had been the 3rd of 4 children in a family that owned the only thing in Fentress that never went out of business. Bramhall and Sons Funeral Home sat on the corner of 4th and Standish in a white building with green awnings, and it had buried the town's grandparents for 4 generations. Her father died when she was 19. Her older brother Nevin took over the license and the building and the hearse, and, being the kind of man he was, also took over the family's opinion of itself. Their mother Lisbeth ran the flowers, the books, and the family. Lisbeth Bramhall had a way of asking questions that were actually verdicts. When Dermot first came to Sunday dinner, she asked him what his people did, and when he said his father set poles for the electric co-op, she said, "Well, that's honest," and passed the beans, and everybody at that table understood exactly what had happened. But before Dermot, there had been Landry Pritchard. Landry was the kind of local disaster that small towns manufacture on purpose. He was good-looking in a way that photographed well and aged badly. He sold boats and four-wheelers out of a lot on Route 60 that his uncle had left him, and he ran it into the ground twice and was bailed out twice. He had a laugh you could hear from the parking lot. He had been arrested at 22 for a bar fight, at 26 for a DUI, and at 29 for a second DUI that should have ended in a felony and did not, because the Bramhalls knew the prosecutor's wife, and because Landry had a talent for standing in front of a judge and looking like a boy who had learned something. Rosanna had been with him, on and off, from the summer she turned 17 until the winter she turned 28. 11 years. Off, then on, then off again, in a cycle that everybody in Fentress could set a watch by. She married Dermot Vickery 14 months after the last of those breakups, and every person at that wedding who was over 40 understood the arithmetic and had the decency not to say it out loud. Then came the thing that reset the whole board. 4 years before the floors got sanded, on a wet April night, Landry Pritchard drove his truck home from a bar in Duncan Falls and hit a man on a bicycle on the county road and did not stop. The man was 58. His name was Otho Rand. He was a retired school custodian riding home from his sister's house, and he lived for 9 days in a hospital in Columbus, and then he did not. There were paint transfers on the bike frame. There was a partial description. There was a county investigator who was 11 months from closing that case around Landry Pritchard's neck, and everybody who knew Landry knew it. 7 weeks later, Landry Pritchard drowned in the Muskingum River. That was the story. He took a boat out alone at dusk from a ramp with no camera. The boat was found against a snag 2 miles down. His wallet and his phone were on the console. The river was high and fast and brown from a week of rain, and the Muskingum keeps what it takes for a while. A body was recovered 11 days later, downstream, in the condition 11 days in that water produces. The funeral was closed casket. Bramhall and Sons handled it at cost, as a kindness, because the Pritchards were nearly broke by then. Nevin Bramhall signed the paperwork. There was a cremation. There was a small, sad service with a photograph on an easel, and Rosanna Vickery sat in the 4th row with her husband's hand in hers and cried in a way Dermot had never seen her cry before. He remembered thinking, at the time, that grief was a strange animal, and that a woman is allowed to mourn the boy she was 17 with, and that he would be a small man to resent it. He remembered, later, something else. He remembered that the crying stopped, completely, about 10 days after the funeral. Not tapered, stopped, and that within a month Rosanna had become, by every visible measure, happier than she had been in years, lighter, more affectionate, humming in the kitchen, planning things. At the time he had told himself she had finally closed a door. The house started keeping records almost immediately, the way houses do, and for the next 412 days it filed report after report, and every one of them got explained away by somebody. The groceries went first. Dermot noticed it the way men notice things, which is not at all, until the credit card app started telling him. Their food spending went up almost 40% in a house where nobody had grown and nobody had started a diet. Rosanna said prices, and she was not wrong. Prices were doing what prices do. Then she said she was donating to the pantry at St. Bride's, which was the kind of thing she did, and which turned out later to be a sentence she had constructed with some care, because it was true 7 times and false 400. The bread was the first thing that was actually strange. She started buying the dense sandwich bread Dermot did not like and Hallie would not touch, 2 loaves a week, and it was never in the house on Saturday. The power bill was next. That July, their electric usage jumped about 160 kilowatt hours over the same month the year before, which is not enough to panic a family, and is exactly enough to bother a man whose entire profession is energy. Dermot spent a Saturday on it. He checked the attic fan, the dehumidifier, the ancient chest freezer in the basement. He never checked the attic circuit, because the attic circuit was 2 receptacles and a light, and there was no reason on earth for it to be pulling anything. He was standing 11 feet from the answer again. It is worth saying plainly, a 250-watt draw, continuous, is a space heater on low, and it comes to almost exactly that number, and the man who could have told you that in his sleep was the man paying the bill. Then there were the sounds, and the sounds are the part that still wakes Dermot up. The furnace in that house was a 1994 gas unit in the basement, and it made a specific noise on startup, a low double knock. Hallie had told them, repeatedly, that the man in the floor coughed, and it sounded like the furnace. Dermot had heard the furnace start in July more than once, and had thought, huh, and had moved on. In July. with the gas valve shut off at the wall, which he did every spring, which he would remember in the driveway one night 400 days later, and have to sit down on the bumper of his own van. There was the laundry. Rosanna had always done laundry on Sunday. Starting that summer, she did it at 2 in the morning, 2 or 3 nights a week, and when he asked, she said she could not sleep, and that was plausible, and it was also a woman making noise on the first floor for 40 minutes while somebody moved. There was the basement stair door, which got a deadbolt in September. She said a neighbor's house on 6th had been broken into through a basement window. That was true. It had. The deadbolt was on the kitchen side, and Dermot noticed and did not think about the direction, because who thinks about the direction of a lock in their own house? It was not there to keep anybody out of the basement. It was there so that if anybody came up the basement stairs unexpectedly, the door would hold long enough. There were the mice. God, there were the mice. Every noise in that house for over a year was mice. Scratching in the hall at 11 o'clock, mice. A thump under the floor of the upstairs bedroom, mice. Dermot put out traps and caught 2, in the garage, in April, and never caught another one anywhere. And Rosanna kept saying mice with such consistency that the word stopped meaning an animal and started meaning nothing at all, which is what a good lie is for. And there was the rug. Hallie's bedroom had a gray wool rug, 6 by 9, with a pattern of small stars, that Rosanna had bought the year they moved in and that lived under the foot of Hallie's bed. Twice, in that period, Dermot moved that rug, once to chase a dropped screw, once when they rearranged for a new dresser, and both times, within a day, it was back exactly where it had been. He never once wondered why a rug had a correct position. Rugs do. That is what rugs are. 2 people did notice things, and both of them were told they were wrong. Wilbur Truesdale came to dinner in October and stood in the upstairs hall waiting for the bathroom and felt the floor give, very slightly, in a way an old oak floor over a proper joist should not. He mentioned it in the van the next morning, casual, the way old tradesmen mention things, and said, "Your hall floor's got a soft foot in it, Derm. Somebody's been in there." Dermot said the house was 110 years old and had been in there by 6 generations of plumbers, and Wilbur said, "Sure," and let it go, and never let it go, because he brought it up again 14 months later at the worst possible moment, and was right both times. And across the street there was Ivar Brackett, 78, retired from the railroad, who had kept a spiral notebook on his kitchen table since 1981, in which he wrote down anything unusual that happened on Standish Street, with the time, because 41 years of freight dispatch does that to a man. Between that April and the following June, Ivar Brackett's notebook contained 31 entries about the Vickery house. Light in the cellar window, 3:10 a.m., man walking east from the alley, 3:40. Same man, ball cap, twice in 1 week. Gray sedan, no plate visible, parked past the hydrant, 4 a.m., gone by 5. He had mentioned the cellar light to Rosanna once, over the fence, in his mild way. She had laughed and said Dermot was up half the night with a project and apologized for the noise, and she had come back an hour later with a plate of lemon bars and stood on his porch for 20 minutes being charming, and Ivar Brackett had gone back inside and written in his notebook. Mrs. V brought bars, did not ask what nights. The 11 days that changed everything started with a hip. Lisbeth Bramhall had a replacement scheduled for the 2nd week of June at Genesis in Zanesville, and Rosanna announced in May that she would be staying at her mother's house through the surgery and the first stretch of recovery. 11 days, maybe 12. Nevin's wife would take the 2nd week. It was presented as a burden and accepted as one, and Dermot drove them out to Lisbeth's on a Sunday and carried the bags in and got a cheek kiss at the door and a hand on his arm that he thought about later a great deal, because it was the first time in a year his wife had touched him without being asked. He drove home with an idea he had been carrying around for 2 years: the floors. The quarter-sawn oak on the 2nd floor had never been refinished, not once in 110 years, and it had gone the color of strong tea, and in the 2 bedrooms it was scuffed down to bare in the traffic lanes. Dermot had priced it out 3 times, and Rosanna had said no 3 times. Too disruptive, too much dust, we'd have to move Hallie out, not while I'm working from home. Now she was gone for 11 days, and Hallie was going to spend most of that week at Wilbur and his wife's farm in Philo, riding a pony named Custard and being spoiled. 11 days was exactly enough to sand, seal, and cure 2 bedrooms and a hall. He called Hewitt Lofgren on the Monday. Hewitt Lofgren had been refinishing hardwood in Muskingum County for 31 years, and if you asked him, he would tell you he had 2 skills. He could read a floor, and he could tell within about 4 seconds whether a customer was going to be trouble. He was 54, built like a mailbox, and he brought his own vacuum system because he had learned in his 20s that the dust is what gets you sued. He walked the 2nd floor with Dermot on the Tuesday morning, ran a hand over the boards in the hall, whistled once at the grain, and quoted a number that was fair. "Somebody loved this house once," Hewitt said. "Somebody's about to again," Dermot said. They started Wednesday. The big drum sander came up the stairs in pieces. Dermot moved the furniture out of the master and the guest room himself on Tuesday night, and Hallie's bed and dresser he broke down and carried to the garage, and he rolled up the gray wool rug with the stars on it and stood it in the corner of the hall, and even then, with the room bare, he did not look at the floor. He looked at the walls, because he was thinking about paint. Thursday at 10:40 in the morning, Dermot Vickery was in the driveway loading a blower door into the van for a job in McConnellsville when his phone rang and the screen said Hewitt Lofgren, which was strange because Hewitt Lofgren was 18 feet above him. He picked up and said, "You need something?" There was a pause on the line long enough that Dermot pulled the phone away to check the call was still connected. "Sir," Hewitt said, and the two, "Sir," was the first wrong thing, because they had been on first names for 2 days. "Can you come up here to the little girl's room?" "What happened? Did you go through a board?" "No, sir." "Hewitt, there's a hatch under your daughter's bed," Hewitt Lofgren said. Dermot stood in his own driveway with a blower door frame in one hand and laughed. One short syllable, not a real laugh, the noise a man makes when a sentence does not fit into any available slot. "There's no hatch in this house," he said. "I've had that floor apart at the register. I've been in that basement 100 times. There's no hatch. I'm going to send you a photograph," Hewitt said, "and then I'd like you to come up." The photograph came through 11 seconds later. Dermot had spent 20 years looking at photographs of building failures. He knew immediately, before he had consciously read anything in the image, that he was looking at work. Not damage, work. The drum sander had taken the ancient finish and about a 32nd of an inch of oak off the floor, and where there had been 100 years of amber varnish, there was now clean pale wood, and in that clean pale wood, 4 feet from the north wall, was a rectangle. 24 inches by 19. The cut was not a crack. A crack in a floor wanders and splinters. This was a saw kerf, straight, with the boards inside the rectangle running in perfect register with the boards outside it, which is a thing that does not happen by accident and takes a patient man most of a day. At the top edge, the sander had exposed 2 brass barrel hinges, mortised flush into the board ends. At the bottom edge, a shallow finger relief had been routed and then filled with tinted wax, which the sandpaper had just taken off. Under 100 years of dark varnish and a gray wool rug, nobody would ever have seen it. That was the point. Somebody had built a door in the floor of a child's bedroom and then hidden it under the one thing in the room that never moved. Dermot went up the stairs 3 at a time in his work boots and stopped in the doorway. Hewitt Lofgren was standing against the far wall with the sander shut off and his respirator pushed up on his forehead and his arms folded, and he had the specific stillness of a man who has decided not to touch anything else. The two of them looked at the rectangle for a while. "You didn't know," Hewitt said. It was not a question, but he needed to hear it. "I've lived here 7 years. All right. My daughter sleeps in this room." Dermot heard his own voice come out flat and strange. "She's 7. She's been telling us for 2 years. There's a man under the floor." Hewitt Lofgren said nothing at all for about 4 seconds, and then he said, "Get a bar." Dermot came back up with a flat bar and a hammer and a headlamp, and he knelt at the bottom edge of the rectangle and slid the bar into the finger relief, and it went in too easily, and he stopped. "Feel that," he said. Hewitt crouched. "Feel what?" "Air." There was air coming up out of the seam. Dermot put the back of his hand across it and held it there. 20 years of blower doors and pressure diagnostics, and he did not need an instrument for this one. But he was already, on some level below thought, running the numbers. Air moves from high pressure to low. Air moves from warm to cold. It was the 2nd week of June. 61 degrees outside. A house with the windows open and no air conditioning running. A crawl space under a floor in June should be cool. It should be pulling air down, not pushing it up. The air coming out of the seam under his daughter's bed was warm, and it was moving, and it smelled like a person, not like mold, not like a dead animal, which was the thing he was braced for, which was the thing he was praying for. It smelled like a sleeping bag. It smelled like scalp, and old coffee, and propane, and unwashed cloth, the smell of a hunting camp on the 4th day, and it was coming up out of the floor of the room where his daughter slept. "Get out of the house," Dermot said. "No," said Hewitt Lofgren. They pried it up together. The hatch came up on its brass hinges with almost no sound, because the hinges had been oiled, and the underside of it was lined with half-inch closed-cell foam that had been glued on and trimmed with a razor knife, which any acoustician will tell you is the cheapest way in the world to kill the sound of a body moving under a floor. Below it, the two of them looked into 19 inches of space, and Dermot Vickery's headlamp lit the whole of it at once, and there was no moment of confusion, no gradual dawning. It was all there in the first second, and his brain took it in the order a builder's brain takes things: structure, then contents, then meaning. The structure was the worst part professionally, and the second worst part as a father. 2 floor joists had been cut, not notched, cut, clean through, and headed off with doubled 2x8s that had been sistered in and lag-bolted, and it was good work. It was work Dermot would have signed off on if he had found it in a remodel. Somebody with real carpentry skill had opened a chase between the joists and then continued it laterally, and the plaster and lath of the ceiling below had been left intact, and the whole cavity had been floored with 1/4-inch plywood and lined, on all sides, with the pink of fiberglass bat insulation faced with foil, which is not there for warmth. It is there for sound. Then the contents: a blue camping mattress, self-inflating, with a sleeping bag on it, unzipped and thrown back the way a bed is when somebody got up and meant to come back. A pillow with a case on it. A 5-gallon bucket with a lid and a bag of pine shavings beside it. A gallon jug of water and 3 empty ones lined up neatly against the header. A canvas grocery bag with the dense sandwich bread in it and a jar of peanut butter with a knife stuck in it. A camp lantern with an orange bulb, which was on. It was on right then, sitting there burning at 10:50 in the morning, and that single fact, that the light was on and nobody was in the room, went through Dermot Vickery like a wire. A power strip, running to an extension cord, running to a heavy gauge cord that disappeared up between the joists toward the attic. A small ceramic space heater, unplugged for the season, sitting on a scrap of cement board. A folding camp stool. A paperback. A phone charger with no phone on it, warm. And on the plywood wall of the chase, at the head of the mattress, at exactly the height of a man's face when he is lying on his side, arranged in 10 neat columns, were the photographs. There were 341 of them, and they had all been taken from below. Somebody had bored a hole through the subfloor and the finished oak, up inside the shadow line where the baseboard met the floor, and set a small lens in it, and every photograph was the same low, wide, ground-level view of a child's bedroom, the underside of a nightstand, the legs of a bed, a rug with stars on it, and a 7-year-old girl. Reading, asleep, sitting on the floor with a plastic accordion folder with a fox on it, crying, once, on a night Dermot could place exactly, because it had been the night the diagnosis came back and Hallie had understood, in the way children do, that the adults had decided to stop believing her. Each photograph had a date written on the white margin in ballpoint. The earliest was 412 days before that morning. There was a shoebox at the foot of the mattress. Inside it, among other things, was a child's front tooth in a plastic film canister with a date on the lid, and a folded page torn out of a floor plan drawing done in crayon, and a hair elastic, and a school photograph that had gone missing from the refrigerator the previous fall, which Rosanna had said Hallie must have thrown away. And under the shoebox, held together with a rubber band, was a stack of letters, and the handwriting on them was the handwriting on the grocery lists on the Vickery's refrigerator, and the top one began, "You have to stay down. 9 more days." Hewitt Lofgren stood up, walked out of the bedroom, down the stairs, out the front door, and got into his truck, and he sat there with both hands on the wheel and did not start it, and did not move for 55 minutes. Dermot Vickery stayed on his knees on the floor of his daughter's room and called 911, and when the dispatcher asked what his emergency was, he found that he had to try the sentence twice. Then, while he was still on the phone, he put his hand flat on the camping mattress. It was warm. Fentress has 14 sworn officers. 11 of them came. The first through the door was a young patrolman named Kenner, who cleared the crawl with a flashlight and a drawn weapon, and came back up gray. By noon, the street was full of vehicles, and Ivar Brackett was standing on his porch across the way with his spiral notebook open, and by 1 o'clock, a detective from the county had taken the scene, and her name was Frances Delano. Detective Delano was in her 50s, and she had the particular calm of somebody who has stopped being surprised and has not yet stopped being angry. She walked the crawl herself on her stomach with a light. She came out with dust in her hair and stood in the hallway for a minute without saying anything. "Mr. Vickery," she said finally, "where's your wife?" "Her mother's. Zanesville. She's been there since Sunday. Does she know about this?" And Dermot Vickery, who had spent his entire adult life believing that the correct response to a problem was to name it out loud and measure it, heard himself say, "No, and I'd like to keep it that way for a little while." Delano looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because the handwriting on those letters is hers," he said. "And because if she finds out there's police in this house, whoever was lying on that mattress this morning is gone by tonight, and he's gone with a head start, and I don't know what he's carrying, and my daughter is 7. The lab confirmed within 30 hours what the letters had already told them, and it confirmed something else that emptied the room. The fingerprints off the lantern, the jug, the camp stool, and the underside of the hatch belonged to Landry Pritchard, deceased, per the state of Ohio, for 3 years and 2 months. There was a stillness in that conference room in Zanesville that Detective Delano described later as the loudest silence of her career. Because a dead man's prints in a crawl space is not a ghost story. A dead man's prints in a crawl space is a fraud, and a fraud that size needs a licensed funeral director, and there was exactly one of those in the Bramhall family. The picture assembled fast once they had the shape of it. Landry Pritchard had been 11 months from an indictment for the hit and run that killed Otho Rand. He had one asset in the world worth anything, a $250,000 term life policy his uncle had taken out on him when the dealership was still solvent, the beneficiary of which had been quietly changed 14 months before the boat went in the water to a trust with Lisbeth Bramhall's name on the paperwork and Rosanna Vickery's name on the distribution. The body in the river had never been Landry Pritchard. It had been a man named in the file only as an unclaimed decedent, transferred from a county morgue 200 miles away. The kind of transfer a funeral home can make on a form. The kind of body nobody comes looking for. Nevin Bramhall had signed for it, and Nevin Bramhall had signed the identification, and Nevin Bramhall had signed the cremation authorization, and every one of those signatures was worth about 5 years. And for 3 years, the man everybody in Fentress believed had drowned had lived 22 miles away in a rented room under a different name, on money that came out of a trust in monthly cash, and it had not been enough for him, and it had not been enough for her, and eventually the arrangement got what arrangements like that always get, which is greedy. The letters told the rest, and Dermot Vickery read every one of them in an interview room with a detective on either side of him, because he insisted. They had started sleeping together again 8 months after the funeral. He came to the house in the daytime while Dermot was on jobs. That was easy, and it went on for over a year. Then his landlord sold the building. Then the trust money got tight, because Lisbeth had gotten nervous about the paper trail. And then, in a letter dated in April 440 days before the sander found the seam, Rosanna Bramhall Vickery had written the sentence that ended any argument about who the villain of this story was. "Nobody looks under a floor. He of all people won't. I've spent 6 years making sure of it." She had not hidden her lover in her husband's house because she was desperate. She had hidden him there because she had already engineered, patiently, over years, the exact conditions that made it safe. A joke at parties about the cameras staying in the van, a household policy signed off by a child psychologist that made going to look into a parenting failure, a word, mice, worn down until it meant nothing, and they had built it together. Landry Pritchard, whatever else he was, had framed houses for 2 summers in his 20s. The chase, the headers, the foam on the hatch, the register of the boards. He had done that work over 9 days in a January, when Dermot was in Marietta on a school district contract, and Rosanna had told her husband she was having the upstairs painted. He had been under his daughter's bedroom floor for 412 days. He had been up in the house. The letters were explicit. Most nights, for hours, when Dermot was asleep. He had eaten at the kitchen table. He had used the shower. There was a letter that discussed, in the flat domestic tone of 2 people planning a kitchen renovation, whether Hallie had recognized his voice when she came downstairs one night, and what to tell Dr. Mulvaney at the next appointment if she reported it. And there was the last letter, dated 9 days before the sander, and it was not about hiding at all. It was about leaving. The 19th of June. School was out. Lisbeth's recovery gave Rosanna a legitimate absence and a car that nobody was tracking. There was a folder. The police found it in the sunroom, in a hanging file marked Taxes 2019, that contained a printed custody worksheet, a list of 3 attorneys in Columbus who specialized in emergency ex parte orders, and a 4-page typed narrative, undated, titled, Timeline of Concerns. The narrative described a husband who had grown withdrawn and obsessive. It described his fixation on the house. It described him waking his daughter at night to search her bedroom, over and over, feeding her a delusion. It cited, by date, 11 appointments with Dr. Aaron Mulvaney, and quoted the phrase, not reinforcing the content. 3 separate times, she was going to take the child, on the 19th, and she was going to take her using the child's own testimony about the man under the floor, the truth, as proof that her father had made it up. That is the moment Dermot Vickery stopped being the victim of this story. Detective Delano told him, on the Friday night, that the standard play was a warrant, a perimeter, a takedown at the mother's house in Zanesville, and a statewide alert for Pritchard. Dermot asked one question. Where is he right now? Nobody knew. The mattress had been warm at 10:50 on Thursday morning. That meant he had left the crawl not long before the sander started, which meant the noise had moved him, which meant he had a way out that did not go through the bedroom, and it meant he had been outside the house, somewhere, watching a floor crew and 11 police cars all day. He'll come back, Dermot said. He'd be an idiot to. He's coming back, Dermot said. He didn't take the shoebox. They found the second exit on Saturday morning, and it was Wilbur Truesdale who found it, because Dermot called him at 6 a.m., and said 4 sentences, and Wilbur was in the driveway in 40 minutes with the smoke machine and every logger in the van. They pressurized the house, a blower door in the front doorway, pushing air in, and then Wilbur walked the perimeter outside with a smoke pencil looking for where it came out. It came out under the back porch, hard, through a gap behind the lattice, and when they pulled the lattice off, there was a hole in the rubble foundation the size of a laundry basket that had been opened and then fitted with a piece of plywood on a French cleat, painted the color of the stone, with a rope handle. Behind it, a low crawl ran 20 feet along the foundation and connected to the old coal chute cellar, and from there, a man could come up into the side yard behind the forsythia, and from the side yard, he could be in the alley in 9 steps. Ivar Brackett came across the street in his cardigan, uninvited, carrying a spiral notebook, and said, "Would you like these, or should I keep waiting?" There were 31 entries, 31 dated, timed observations of a man moving in and out of that alley at 3 and 4 in the morning, written down by a 78-year-old railroad dispatcher who had told the wife once and been handed a plate of lemon bars. Detective Delano read them standing in the side yard and then looked up at Dermot Vickery and said, "All right, tell me your idea." Here is Dermot Vickery's idea, and it is the reason this story is worth telling. He did not propose a manhunt. He did not propose a confrontation. He proposed the only thing he actually knew how to do, which was to take a building and make it tell him the truth. Except this time, for the first and only time in his career, he was going to make the building lie. He trusts this house, Dermot said. That's the whole thing. He's lived in it for over a year, and he has never once been wrong about it. He knows what it sounds like when I get up. He knows which stair creaks. He knows my van in the driveway, and my wife's schedule, and how long the shower runs. He isn't hiding from us. He's at home. Here, so we put the house back exactly the way he left it, and then we change one thing at a time, And every single thing we change, we get to choose. It took 40 hours. They put the hatch back, on its hinges, with the wax in the finger relief. They put the mattress back and the sleeping bag thrown open the way it had been, and the jug and the bucket and the bread. The photographs went back in their 10 columns. The lab had them imaged in a night. The shoebox went back, minus the tooth, which Dermot would not allow, and which Delano did not argue about. Then, into the joist bays around that chase, they installed the actual trade. 4 infrared cameras, cheap ones, on the sistered headers, looking down the crawl in both directions. 2 temperature and humidity loggers, 3 contact microphones, the kind Dermot used for finding water in walls, taped to the plywood floor of the chase, and to the plywood cleat under the porch. A door sensor, the kind that costs $9, on the back of the false stone. A laptop in the garage. Then the part that was actually clever. Dermot Vickery had spent 20 years learning that you can move air through a building the way you move water through a pipe, and that a man in a crawl space lives entirely at the mercy of where the air is going. He set up the blower door in the basement stairwell, reversed, and he ran ducting and a variable transformer, and he built himself a dial. With that dial he could depressurize the crawl space relative to the house, or pressurize it, and by doing so he could decide, absolutely, which direction the air under his daughter's floor moved and what it carried with it. He tested it Saturday night with a theatrical fog machine Hewitt Lofgren brought over from his brother-in-law's band, and he watched on a laptop screen in his own garage as fog he had introduced in the coal cellar traveled the length of the crawl in 90 seconds, or did not travel at all, or went the other way, depending on nothing but which way he turned a knob. "You're going to smoke him out," Delano said. "No," said Dermot. "Smoke makes a man run. I don't want him to run. I want him to feel like nothing at all is wrong, right up until the second the floor stops being his." Then he called his wife. The call was 90 seconds long, and Detective Delano recorded it with his consent. He told Rosanna the floors had come out beautiful. He told her he had done it as a surprise, and he was sorry, and he could hear her deciding, in the pause, how angry to be about a surprise. He told her the crew had finished early, that Hallie was at Wilbur's until Wednesday, and that he had booked the corner table at Aldergrove for Tuesday night, because it would have been their 8th anniversary on the 4th, and they had missed it. "You did the floors," she said. "Whole second floor, sanded to bare and sealed. It's like a different house." There was a silence on the line that lasted 3.5 seconds. On the recording you can hear a television in Lisbeth Bramhall's living room, and you can hear Rosanna Vickery breathe out through her nose. "Hallie's room too?" "Hallie's room first." "Huh," she said, and then, in a bright voice, "Well, I can't be mad at that, can I? She came home Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon. There were 4 people in that house who knew what was going to happen, and none of them were visible. Delano and a second detective were in the attic. Wilbur Truesdale was in the garage with the laptop and the dial. Hewitt Lofgren, who had refused to go home, was parked in the alley behind Ivar Brackett's garage in a truck full of floor sanding equipment, which is the least suspicious vehicle in the state of Ohio. Dermot met his wife at the door and carried her bag in, and she hugged him, and she said the hall smelled like a gymnasium, and she laughed, and she went up the stairs. He timed her, because Delano had asked him to. 81 seconds after she walked through the front door of her own house, Rosanna Vickery was standing in her daughter's bedroom, and she was looking at the floor. The gray wool rug with the stars on it was exactly where it had always been. Dermot watched from the doorway and made himself say the line he had rehearsed in the van 11 times. The guy wanted to know why the rug had a dent in the finish under it. "I told him you're particular," his wife laughed. That is the thing he could not get past afterward, in the months of it. She laughed, easily, and she said, "I am particular," and she came over and kissed him on the jaw, and her heart rate must have been 140, and she was already thinking about how to get down to the coal cellar in the next hour to leave a note that said, "The floors are done, it's safe, 7 more days." She never got the chance, because Dermot never left her alone, all evening, in the pleasant, relentless way of a man being romantic. At Aldergrove, over dinner, they had a conversation that ran on 2 levels. She asked about Hallie. He said Hallie was fine, riding custard, sunburned. She asked whether the crew had been up in the attic. He said no reason to be. She asked, twice, in different words, whether anything had come up during the work, and he said the only surprise was a soft spot in the hall that Wilbur had noticed a year ago and turned out to be nothing. And she said, "See? He's always seeing problems." And she reached across the table and took her husband's hand, and Dermot Vickery looked at his wife's face and understood, completely and for the first time, that she was not a woman who had made a terrible mistake. She was a woman who was good at this. She had been good at it for a very long time, in front of him, every day, and he had never once had a reason to check. He was not angry at that table. He would be angry later, for about 2 years. At that table he was something colder and more useful, which was patient. They got home at 9:40. He poured her a second glass of wine and she took it up to the bath, and at 10:15, alone in the kitchen, Dermot Vickery took out his phone and texted one word to the garage. "Go." At 10:16, Wilbur Truesdale turned the dial. Nothing happened that anyone in that house could hear. The crawlspace under the second floor of the Vickery house went from neutral to slightly positive, and the air that had been drifting toward the coal cellar for 412 days reversed and began, very gently, to move the other way, toward the hatch and up. It was the sort of change no person would consciously notice. Landry Pritchard had lived under that floor for over a year, and he knew that house through his skin, and at 10:41 that night, he came in through the false stone under the back porch, because a man who is told the floors are finished comes home. The $9 door sensor fired. 4 infrared cameras picked him up as a white smear against gray on a laptop in the garage. He crawled 20 feet along the foundation, and then 22 feet up the chase, and Dermot Vickery watched him do it on a screen, with his fist against his mouth, and did not make a sound. He watched the man reach the mattress. He watched him take out his phone and check it. He watched him settle onto his side, 6 inches under the floor of the room where a 7-year-old had spent 2 years trying to make somebody believe her. Then Dermot went upstairs and put his hand on the light switch of his daughter's bedroom and did the only cruel thing he did in this entire story. He turned on the little lamp with the paper moonshade, and he pulled the reading chair over, and he opened the book that was still on the nightstand, and he read 4 pages of it out loud, in a room with no child in it, because there was one thing in 441 letters and 341 photographs that Landry Pritchard could not stay still for. She read out loud tonight. He had written 11 separate times. It was the only thing in that crawlspace that was tender, and it was the most obscene thing in it, and Dermot Vickery had read it in an interview room and known exactly what it was. He read 4 pages, and Landry Pritchard rolled onto his back and pushed up on the hatch to hear better, the way he had 100 times. The hatch did not move, because Hewitt Lofgren had put 6 3-inch structural screws through the header into it on Sunday afternoon. Neither did the plywood cleat under the porch, because Hewitt had done that one too. From the outside, at 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Rosanna Vickery was upstairs looking at a rug. There was a sound then that the contact microphones recorded, and that has been played twice in an Ohio courtroom. A man in 19 inches of space, discovering, in the dark, that both ends of it are closed. Dermot stood up, and put the book down on the chair, and spoke to the floor. "There's a 2-way in the bucket," he said. "Channel 3, don't waste the battery." Then he went down to the dining room, where his wife had come out of the bath in her robe with her hair up, having heard something and understanding nothing, and he set the handheld radio on the table in front of her, and he turned it on. And Rosanna Vickery, believing, because her husband had spent 7 years being a man who could be relied upon to tell you exactly what he knew, that the situation was salvageable, that this was a marriage crisis and not a felony, picked up the radio and started talking. She talked for 19 minutes. She told Landry to stay calm and that she would handle it. She told him not to say anything about April, meaning the boat. She told him she had the folder ready and the attorney's name, and that if it came to it, they would say Dermot had built it, that Dermot was the one with the tools and the crawlspace obsession, that Hallie would say whatever they needed her to say, because Hallie had been saying it for 2 years already. Detective Francis Delano came down the attic stairs at minute 20 with 2 officers behind her, and Rosanna Vickery was still holding the radio. Landry Pritchard was cut out of the floor of that house at 1:15 in the morning by the Fentress Fire Department, and he came up through his own hatch with a firefighter's hand around his upper arm, and the thing every person on that scene remembers is that he asked, in the driveway, whether anyone had fed his phone charger, which is what 412 days in 19 inches does to a mind. He is serving 31 years. The hit-and-run death of Otho Rand carried the weight of it. The fraud, the stalking, and the child endangerment counts carried the rest. And the identity fraud is what took any chance of parole off the table before 61. Nevin Bramhall lost his license, his family's building, and 8 years for the unclaimed decedent he signed for and burned. The state of Ohio takes a very dim view of what he did with a body nobody was coming for. The funeral home is a dentist's office now. Lisbeth Bramhall was 71 and had known since the second month, and she took a plea for the insurance and did 18 months, and she went into it saying her daughter had made a mistake, and she came out of it not saying anything to anyone. Rosanna Bramhall Vickery went to trial because her attorney believed the jury would not convict a mother. It took them under 4 hours. Conspiracy, insurance fraud, and the count that made the local paper twice, child endangerment, on the theory that a parent who installs a grown man under her daughter's bedroom floor and then medicates the child for reporting it has committed something the law had to work to find a name for. She got 22 years. She has written to Hallie 11 times. Rachel Bledsoe, who handled the custody, has a folder for those letters, and Hallie knows they exist and has been told, clearly, that they will be there when she is 18 and wants them, and that until then, nobody is going to make her do anything. Dermot Vickery has full custody and got it in a hearing that lasted 40 minutes. The part he asked for, and got, was this. He asked that Hallie's drawings be entered. 2 years of overhead floor plans in an accordion folder with a fox on it, a rectangle for the room, a smaller rectangle under the bed, and a shape inside it lying on its side with no face. Dr. Erin Mulvaney sat on the stand and was asked whether, in 11 sessions, any adult had ever brought her a photograph of the child's bedroom floor, and she said no. And then she said something that Rachel Bledsoe made sure went in the record, that in her entire career she had never once been given a chart in which the parent supplying the history was the source of the phenomenon. And Dermot did the only thing left, which was the hard, unglamorous, honest thing. He sat down with his 7-year-old daughter at Wilbur Truesdale's kitchen table in Philo, with a pony visible through the window, and he told her that there had been a man under her floor, that she had been right every single time, that he had looked and had not looked hard enough, and that the reason she had stopped being believed was not because she was small or because she was wrong, but because a grown-up had needed her not to be believed. He did not soften it. He did not say, "We thought," he said. "I was wrong." Then he asked her what she wanted him to do about her room, and she thought about it for a long time, the way she thought about everything, and she said she wanted the floor taken out. All of it, not covered up, out. So he took it out. 110 years of quarter-sawn white oak, up, by hand, over a weekend, with Hewitt Lofgren and Wilbur Truesdale and a 78-year-old railroad dispatcher who brought sandwiches and would not be told no. They opened the joist bays to daylight. They sistered the 2 cut joists properly and pulled every scrap of that pink foil-faced bat out of the chase and threw it in a dumpster in the driveway. And Hallie Vickery stood in the doorway in safety glasses her father had bought her in her own size and watched the hole in her floor stop existing. Then they laid a new floor, and she picked it, and it is maple, and it is pale, and there is no rug on it anywhere. She is 9 now. She still draws floor plans. For about a year after, she asked her father to check under her bed at night, and he did. Every night, without one word of protest, without ever once saying, "There's nothing there." He got down on the floor with the little thermal camera from the van, which is the size of a paperback, and he put it under the bed frame, and he showed her the screen, and they looked at it together. Cool blue floor, cool blue wall, 2 warm shapes that were a man and a girl, and nothing else in the room that was giving off any heat at all. "Clear," she'd say. "Clear," he'd say. And then he'd go get her water, because she always wanted water after. She stopped asking in the spring she turned 9. He still keeps the camera on the shelf in her closet, charged, where she can reach it, and neither of them has ever discussed why. Vickery Building Diagnostics still does schools and churches and moisture claims across 3 counties. But 2 or 3 times a month now, Dermot takes a call that does not come through the business line, from a parent somewhere in southeastern Ohio who has heard the story and whose child keeps saying something about the walls or the floor or the crawl space, and who has been told by everyone that it is nothing. He drives out. He does not charge them. He walks the house with the camera and the blower door and the microphones, and almost every single time, he finds a duct leak or a sump or a raccoon or nothing at all, and he tells the parents so, and they are relieved. And then he says the same sentence every time before he packs the van, and he says it to the child, not to the adults. You were right to say something. Say it again if it happens again. I want to close this one out the way a building inspector closes a report, because I think it is the only honest way to hold it. Not a moral. A cost sheet. 19 inches of clearance. 412 days. 341 photographs. 160 extra kilowatt hours in a single July. 2 loaves of bread a week. 31 entries in an old man's spiral notebook that nobody asked to read. 11 appointments with a very good doctor who was given a very bad history. 2 cut joists. 1 rug that always went back to the same place. And 1 7-year-old girl who told the adults in her life the exact truth, in plain language, with drawings, for 2 years, and was medicated for it. Add that up, and here is what it cost. Nothing, until somebody sanded a floor. The thing I keep turning over is that not one item on that list was hidden. Every single one of them was sitting in the open, in a bill, in a receipt, in a noise, in a smell, in a child's sentence. The information was never missing. What was missing was one adult willing to treat the information as information instead of as an inconvenience, a mood, a phase, or a symptom. So, 19 inches. At the start of this, it was the space a man hid in. By the end, it is the distance between a father's hand and a thermal screen under his daughter's bed, every night for a year, with no argument. Same number, completely different house. If a kid in your life keeps saying the same strange thing, and it keeps getting more specific instead of less, go look. Go look badly. Go look at 3 in the morning. Go look and be embarrassed. Being wrong about that costs you an hour.